Well, once again, welcome to worship. In the midst of all that's going on in the world, we are celebrating, and I'm really grateful for that. I'm grateful for what God has done, not only over the last 2 years through Common Grace, but really over the last 3 or 3.5 years as we've been planning and as we were planning and all of that. And so I'm grateful you're here this morning, and in the midst of the up and down that the last week has been, really no matter your perspective, I think it is good to pause and to give thanks for some of what God is doing in the midst of community and in the midst of our lives. This morning I want to read from Colossians, the 3rd chapter, a bit of advice, a bit of direction about what it means to be the people of God, what it means to be a community of faith that Paul is writing to the church in Colossia. We'll begin in verse 12. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in the one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell within you richly. Teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, and with gratitude in your hearts, sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs to God. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. May God add blessing and understanding to these words this morning. Well, I am so grateful for the journey that we've been on over these last 2 years. And as a way of celebrating that, I put on this, what's become one of my very favorite shirts. I call it my classy Common Grace garb. So when you don't have to be all the way dressed up, but maybe our Common Grace t-shirts are not appropriate, this is what I wear. And this was the funny thing, as I was picking this out as far as what to wear this morning, it suddenly hit me like, of course, this is what I need to wear. And here's the interesting thing. As I'm putting it on, I'm thinking of all of these different memories that I've had over the last couple of years. I didn't just buy this in the last couple of years, but I think of going to speak to the Chamber of Commerce and wearing this. Because again, it was a little bit classy, but it wasn't a t-shirt, but it wasn't overstated. And I think about some great conversations that I've had there. I think about different places where I've told people about what was happening at Common Grace. I think about different times where we've had events and I've worn this. And so all of these memories sort of begin to come back to me because of this. And it's funny the way that happens with what we choose to wear sometimes. I have this particular sweater vest kind of thing that I was wearing when I got engaged to my now wife, Hope. And every time I put that on, even though I had it for a long time before and I've had it all these years since, every time I wear that, I'm reminded of that particular day and of that celebration. There is a sweatshirt that I have, and it's one of my most comfortable sweatshirts. I got it while I was in college. And what I think of every time I wear that is a picture of me and one of my pledge brothers in the fraternity who passed away. But every time I wear that, I think of Mo, because there's a picture of he and I in it. And so all of these memories come back. Do you have that same sort of thing? Certain articles of clothing, maybe a particular hoodie or sweater, or maybe there's a shirt that you wear. Maybe you have some clothes that have long since worn out, but you refuse to get rid of them because of the memories that they have attached to them. It is this funny thing, the way that what we wear affects our disposition and brings back all of these memories. But I think it's from that place that Paul is calling us in Colossians to remember and to choose what it is that we put on. He's using clothing. He's putting the idea of getting dressed. He's using that as a metaphor for how it is that we are to live our life of faith, what it means to be a follower of Christ, what it means to be a community of followers of Christ. And so he's imploring the church at Colossia to put on these different things. He begins with this list: compassion and kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Put these on, or clothe yourself in these things. He's telling them, giving them the basic building blocks of what it means to be a community of faith. To choose these things, and on these foundations, you can begin to build. Later, or he will continue to say, bear with one another. Be forgiving of one another, for Christ has been forgiving of you. And he's telling us what it looks like, using this idea of clothing, to begin to look like the church. And we know that for any kind of relationship, whether that be a one-on-one sort of relationship, whether that be you to a group of people, perhaps coworkers, friends, whatever the case is, or a church to a larger community, whatever, we know that these ideals, these attributes are building blocks, are foundations for any kind of relationship, and especially a relationship that's marked by Christ. And so we begin to try to build on these sort of foundations, on these ideas. And at Common Grace, from the beginning, from the time that this was just sort of some sort of idea we felt like God was calling us to, and as we began to flesh out that process, as we were trying to figure out what it means to assemble a community of faith in a new time and a new place for a particular community, we're building on the foundations that go all the way back to Christ, all the way back to the church at Colossae, that the church through the generations has used as foundation and as building block, talking about compassion and kindness and humility and meekness and patience. And so we're building on that foundation. And then our question, our charge began to be, what does it look like to take that and to share that, to package that, to present that to a world that sometimes doesn't have time or place for the church, or doesn't think that the church is as relevant as it used to be, or has been burned or hurt by the church, or present it to families who perhaps assess value propositions differently than they did 40 and 50 and 60 years ago. And that became part of our understanding. On that foundation, what does it look like to share the church, to take the church to the world? And so we've been asking that question, building on that foundation. We've been building on the foundation that's come in the generations since then. We talked about that last week with All Saints Day, how we have inherited a faith that has been wrestled with and adapted and grown to be understood for different contexts and different times and different places. And we're grateful for the ways, most especially that's been personally valuable to our own faith, the people who we know, whose names we can say, that have helped provide a foundation for our individual faith. And so we talked about that. And then over these last 18 months, over the last 2 years and the 18 months leading up to it, we began to dream about what different sorts of partnerships would look like. And we began to build on the best of the rich tradition that we have as a Methodist faith, using the liturgy and the experience and the wisdom that's come over the hundreds of years of the Methodist movement, being attached and connected and deeply rooted in something that is much more broad than this particular moment and this particular space. We've tried to pull the best of that, and sometimes we've done a good job and sometimes we haven't, and we continue to work on that and to understand what it means to do that in this time, in this place. And we come from the Grace United Methodist Church, the heart of that church, and we've tried to build from and take from and learn from and celebrate the deep, committed nature that church has had for so long to serve those who are most in need. We do that all the time in all kinds of ways, and try to build on that and understand what that looks like. And so all of that provides foundation for who we are. And we continue to try to understand what God calls us to in the future for us. We continue to build on these same words that Paul calls the Colossians to. And we continue to think about what that looks like now. So for Paul, this idea of clothing is It's metaphorical, certainly, but it's also rooted in a deep and visceral communal understanding that his original audience would have had. It's not just about what clothes you choose to put on in the morning and what that looks like for the day. It's also about the experience of baptism. Now, we do baptism a little bit differently now, but in that time, in that place, what would happen is after weeks, more similar to like a confirmation process, after weeks or months of this process of growing, when you would come to be baptized, you literally would come to a river or a body of water, and you would take off all of your clothes on one side and leave them on the shore, and you would go into the water and you would come out and new clothes would be put on you. And so when Paul is talking about the clothing that you pick, he's also talking about this experience that the members of this church have had, that they've each had in their own right and they've shared, of putting on an entirely new way of being. In baptism, we recognize and we celebrate the justifying grace of God, and we name that and we claim that. And then for the rest of our life, we're in this process of sanctifying grace, of coming to understand what it means to live most like God has intended us to. And so for Paul, that idea of putting new clothes on is about being made new in Christ, and it's about being initiated into the community of faith. And coming to understand what that means over a process, over time. That's what Paul is talking about. That's what his audience is hearing in this metaphor. They've got this shared experience. And it's transformative, not only for the individual, but for the community. If we would have read just before where we started our reading today, verse 11 says this, and these words perhaps are familiar to you. In that renewal that comes in baptism, in that renewal, there is no longer Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, slave or free, but Christ is all and in all. And I love that. What he's saying is there is this new identity that you've come to be a part of. You've been grafted into this family, and in that community, you find a new identity and you find a new kind of home. So Paul then proceeds to direct them about how they are to build that house, how they are to build that home together, what that community looks like when we clothe ourselves with compassion and kindness and humility and meekness and patience. And that becomes the starting place to continue to discover God's grace, to continue to uncover what that means and looks like. That becomes the starting place by which the church relates to the world. And while you're in the process of trying to experience that, struggling to experience that in community and share that, it's there that you find this struggle within yourself to be who God has intended you to be. It's there that you find that struggle within the community to be the community of faith for the world. It's there that in your neighborhood we're challenged to be God's hands and feet and to see that change eventually enacted in the world. That's what God is calling us to. And we begin that work of participating in this deep personal and communal work of understanding what this reconciliation that God has come to announce in Jesus Christ, what that means for everybody involved. And that's the kind of life that Paul is calling us to. That's what Paul is calling us to put on, to clothe ourselves in. One thing that I like about this metaphor, this idea, is that the clothing that we put on, it's a choice, and it is a daily choice. Certainly there's an aspect that Paul is speaking to about this baptismal piece, and certainly it's something that we know that people do every single... So we have this choice about what it is that we put on, how it is that we choose to live, what our disposition is. And this work, as we said earlier, this work of sanctifying faith, it's an ongoing work, and it's a choice that we participate in as we seek to live to be faithful to God's call. And so we get to choose what that looks like. Are we compassionate and patient or not? And certainly there will be those days where it's more difficult than other days. Perhaps in the hours after an election, perhaps in the year 2020 for all that it is. Maybe it feels a little bit more difficult to choose those. And there are times where we slip and stumble. And I think of maybe you wake up late and you run into the dark closet or reach into the hamper, wherever you store your clothes, and you reach for something and you realize when you get to your destination that maybe you didn't quite grab what you thought. Maybe you don't quite match, that sort of thing. There are days where that happens, and yet we have this choice. How do we choose to clothe ourselves? Do we choose the compassion and the patience and the meekness and humility, or do we choose another route? And so we get this message from Paul about how we are to choose to live. And it's challenging, maybe especially in these days. But then he sort of sums it up with this in verse 14 and 15. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. I love that word. Similar to Hebrews 11:1 that we read last week, perhaps that is a verse to sort of commit to memory. Perhaps that's a succinct thing for us to remember. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. What a challenge and what a gift, what a promise. To believe, to trust that God is working to bind together what sometimes feels especially broken, what sometimes feels especially wounded, what sometimes feels especially distant. God, through God's love and God's power, is binding things together that they may exist in harmony, that we may exist in harmony. It may not always feel perfect. It won't. But God continues to work with and through us. And then in verse 15, and let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. So I was thinking this week about that idea. Be thankful. And just like we do in October as we embark on this stewardship campaign every year, we get to celebrate what God is doing in the church and what we think God is calling us to. And last year on our first birthday, we got to celebrate what God had done in the first year of our time. And the day we launched, we celebrated what we had already seen God doing in the midst of our community. And we come today, and so I'm thinking this week, I'm reflecting on this last year, and it's interesting. Because in some ways it feels like the year's been cut short by maybe half or three quarters. And in other ways I see different things that have happened, ways that God has been working. And I take this challenge, as we talked about a bit last month, as Paul writes to the Philippians, to be thankful. And so I was thinking about some of the things that I'm thankful for. We said that when we began this journey and we felt like God was calling us on this journey, a lot of it was about understanding what the church looks like, not only right now, but in the future. And that we need to grow in our understanding of that. And friends, we haven't figured all of that. We haven't figured all of anything out, but we've made steps towards that. And so one of the ways that looks this year is certainly, I so much wanted us to be together to celebrate this second anniversary. And I'm thankful for, and these are just the people that I know of for a couple in Minneapolis that joins us faithfully to worship every week now that we're online. And I'm thankful for a couple in Wichita who joins us faithfully every week to worship because we're online. And I'm thankful for someone who said, I didn't often get to make it Sunday mornings because of my work schedule, but now I get to worship sometime in the week, every week. And so I celebrate that and celebrate this forced experience that we've had to continue to understand what it means to be the church in a world that is moving forward. And we'll continue to grow and to adapt in that. And certainly we'll look forward to gathering together. But what we trust is that even in our disparate times and disparate places, that by the power of God's love at work, all of us are being bound together in harmony. And I give thanks for that on this particular morning. I give thanks for the ways that I've seen people across all sorts of spectrums, most particularly age spectrums, from young adults to older adults, empty nesters, retired folks, to people just starting their careers and not yet even starting families, and the way that we've seen community build across all of that. I give thanks for that. I love that. And we've seen even some of that continuing on as people have been forced apart, checking in on one another. How great is it to have somebody more than twice your age checking in just to see how you're going? I love that. And what we know is that from our different experiences in different places, by God's power and God's love, we continue to be bound together in harmony. And I give thanks for that. I think about the work that continues to happen at the Center of Grace. I think about many of you who were a part of that, many of you who have supported that. I think about the grace of God that we got to gather for Grace Extravaganza before the pandemic hit. And I think about how I've had the chance to go see what one of the products of that over at the Center of Grace, and how many of you will be extremely excited when you get to see that in person. And I give thanks for the way that this church in 3 locations is continuing to be bound together as we figure out what it means to be a church in this time, in this place. And that there is harmony in the midst of that because of God's work. It was funny. Certainly there have been a ton of adaptations that Stacy and Grace and Mona have made over these last several months. But I think about this underlying commitment to continue to imagine what faith looks like for our youngest followers of Jesus, and for our next generations, and for the families that support them. And again, there's so much that we haven't done. But I was thinking about pancakes and pajama jam. Whatever that was that we did the Sunday between Christmas and New Year's. And again, it was something for a week that's a weird week for worship, and people are traveling and all of that. And actually, my wife and I were on our way out of the country later that afternoon, but we gathered in this place. And what it marks not so much is, it's not just the event, but it's this commitment and this adaptation. And I was thinking about that. And I've never given a message in pajamas before, but hey, there's a first time for everything. I could go on and on about these different things. I'm grateful that we still had people participating in this Team World Vision running challenge this year, even though it looked very much different. I'm grateful for the COVID picnic that we had a few weeks ago. That sounds really bad. For the picnic that we had in the midst of COVID, that's what I meant, a few weeks ago, where we could be distant and safe and talk to one another, and that we got to do that. There's so much going on, and I think about, we shared earlier in this service, we're getting ready for this year's Living Nativity that'll look different than it did last year. And last year, it wasn't the volume of people there or the people that were interested in online that was most impressive to me. It was about this community of faith's commitment to figuring out what it looks like to take church to a place, to a world, to a time, to partnerships that sometimes would be considered less traditional. And what that allows us is to have incredible conversations. Some of you shared about the conversations you had with people that night. We had conversations with the staff at our host location that never would have happened otherwise. I had conversations for days and actually weeks after that via text with people who had gotten my number at that event. And I think about those kinds of things and what it means to be a community of faith that says we can bind together these different spheres and trust that by the power of God's Spirit at work, there will be harmony and blessing in that. And so, friends, I am grateful on this day for what God is doing, for the ways that we're continuing to be blessed. I'm grateful for the home that we find in the midst of that community seeking to put on compassion and kindness and humility and meekness and patience together. I'm grateful for the way that we find a sense of belonging and identity and what Christ calls us to do together. And I'm grateful to see where this journey will lead in the next year. Thank you for being a part of that. Again, whether you're new on this journey or you've been a part of it for years, I hope that we continue to be blessed in it and to find a sense of community and belonging and home in that community of faith. I hope that we continue to experience what it means to feel like we belong there. It's sort of, I hope with time, becomes like putting on your favorite sweater or jacket or shirt. Amen. Let's take a few moments for reflection.